Well, here we are again, Galatians chapter 3, continuing on. This lesson is Galatians 3, 6 through 9. Father Abraham had many sons, and here the Apostle Paul is drawing upon the analogy with Abraham, and it's actually a brilliant move, because if you remember, these individuals had apparently come from Jerusalem, and what better place for Paul to point out that it is by faith, salvation is by faith, the gospel, with the very first person that God called out to begin his people in the Old Testament, with Abraham, called him from Ur of the Chaldees and gave him a promise that he would have many sons. And that's the song way that we put it. But the truth of the matter is that in Abraham, all nations of the earth would be blessed. We know that God promised him a biological heritage, somebody from his very own loins, that there would be a ethnic people, Israel. But then we also know that there was a spiritual people that would come through. And in particular, the seed wasn't just a reference to a plurality of people, but it was in particular a reference to Jesus Christ, which is covered here in the book of Galatians. So as we look at this lesson, a couple of things to keep in mind. We want, as lesson objectives, to remember that to reveal the righteousness imputed, that word imputed means to put to an account, to Abraham was by faith. Secondly, to see faith in the Lord's righteousness continue to increase in the lives of believers. So just because you have the righteousness imputed to you the moment you receive Christ doesn't mean that you always live like that has been imputed to you, or believe as if that's been imputed to you, or moment by moment feel like that's been imputed to you. And so we want to see, because remember, this letter is written to people who are already believers, and they have reverted back. And so Father Abraham had many sons. Verse 6 draws upon the father of the nation of Israel to point out how his faith is what brought the crediting to his account. And a few takeaways from here. God is the one who filled Abraham's empty account. And in the lesson, you'll see that the words that are used in Genesis 15, as well as here in Galatians, teach us that it wasn't righteousness dealing with his righteous behavior, but it was a righteousness that Abraham needed that was given to him by God. And Abraham believed God, and it was credited him for righteousness. So, in other words, Abraham had an empty account, but God is the one who filled it. God declares Abraham righteous, or sees Abraham as if he is living righteously. And then God credits this righteousness. This implies the need of Abraham, or the fact that he was not previously righteous in God's eyes. And then God credits the righteousness, that's God's part, and Abraham believes. That's Abraham's part. And so we see both of those at work here, verse number 6. Now, verse number 7, Paul draws the connection between Abraham's faith and all those who have the faith of like kind. And that means even in this generation, those who have the same faith, but really remember the original recipients. The original recipients are receiving false information, another gospel that is saying and teaching them that they have to do more than just have faith, if you will, in order to be a child of Abraham. They have to partake in the law. And Paul is pointing out and saying, no, it's by faith, the same kind of faith that Abraham had, and it was one where he was not keeping a law or doing good deeds in order to have the righteousness imputed to him. So then verses 8 and 9 should also be noted that God's original intention was to offer this blessing to the Gentiles. Remember, the original recipients were primarily Gentiles, as well as to the Jews. Now, what is the blessing of verse 8 and 9? I'll let you study that out in the passage. It's very clear, very explicit. It's not just any blessing, but there's a particular blessing that the passage itself points to in those verses. So I hope you'll take time to study that out, because it is critical for the passage. How does the meaning apply? Several things. God fully credits the bankrupt accounts of sinful believing men. It is an account that man does not and cannot deposit into. And so I think it's important to realize that when someone comes to God by faith in Christ, it isn't that they are depositing into the bank account and God adds to that righteousness the righteousness of Jesus. It's a bank account that's completely empty and we have no way to deposit into. And then when the righteousness of Jesus Christ is deposited into it, there's no need for any additional righteousness of man to be deposited into that account. It's important to understand that because these original recipients were being told, don't just believe Jesus, but add the righteousness of your own works and law to that, which is showing that what has been deposited in the righteousness of Jesus is not enough. And then this means also that we must ensure that whenever we speak of moral behavior or perceived righteousness or Christian living, we always tie it directly to the full account of righteousness that we have with God, in spite of the fact that we are yet sinners. In other words, what we want to encourage is don't just say and promote moralism. Don't just say you should be like that or you should live this way, but instead tie it back to why we should live this way. We don't want to live this way because we're depositing into a righteousness into an account that gains us merit with God. What we want to understand is that while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us, because now, in God's eyes, with God, our position is settled by the righteousness of Jesus Christ. That should free us then to live the way that we know the Bible makes clear we should be living, but it's all by the power of the Spirit, and it is all because of the complete righteousness I've already received in Jesus Christ. So even as we emphasize things, and I give you some examples in the lesson emphasizing things, and there are areas we don't do this in. Consider a couple of things, and you don't want to just expose behaviors in your own life. You want to identify heart considerations. So consider the mental judgments we make when we see someone who made a poor decision about a relationship or a career. Sometimes we tend to pity them as if they are foolish and oh how ridiculous they are. And the truth of the matter is that those mental judgments flow out of a heart oftentimes of not understanding pride or arrogant, not understanding how sinful we were, and we're proud and arrogant in that position. We need to be careful here. Consider the individuals who you intentionally avoid. You know, some people, because they don't have certain behaviors, or they don't look a certain way, or they possibly don't meet a certain standard that we might hold them to, we intentionally avoid those individuals. We make statements like, well, we shouldn't hang around people like that, or they're a bad influence on me. And what we do is we start to create these walls of separation amongst believing people. And it's very dangerous. These are just modern applications of how sometimes we try and force people to live righteous lives so that then we would accept them. And this is absolutely contrary to the righteousness we've received in Jesus Christ, which is by grace through faith. Another, consider those individuals who you will subconsciously neglect today. People who don't have your same socioeconomic status. People that you've just learned, you've got habits and learned behaviors that we avoid. And unless they do something, or unless they garner our attention by some effort, then we won't even give them the time of day. And that's in no way, that's trying to make a person earn a status with us. Consider how you feel about the person who interrupted your attention during the service because they were snickering or moving around. I mean, think even just about things like that, things that are our pet peeves and ways that we treat others. In other words, let me just flip that one around. In other words, if you want me to be happy with you, then you better live and act this way in a service. And unfortunately, I'm just thankful that God didn't require me to live a certain life that I could never live. Otherwise, I would be forever banished to an eternal hell. The truth is that the life I could not live, Jesus Christ lived it. And because of that, I'm now free to not only live that life and enabled to live that life, but also to have that kind of a kindness and expectation of others. So consider also the person who was involved in the grossest imaginable sin possible. Think of how many times we don't spend time accepting or forgiving these people. Consider the generic statements we make that reveal our tendency towards legalism, and I give you an example in your lesson on that. And so the list of examples could go on, but the truth remains the same. It is imperative that Christians continue to understand and believe that faith is what brings God's full accounting of righteousness. This is not just some teaching that needs to be preached to unbelieving people, but believers manifest whether they have faith in the justification they've received by how they think, speak, and behave. Radical insecurity is a mark of another gospel. God bless you, and I hope you take time to study it out a little bit more as you prepare to teach this lesson.